Hello, everybody. 40 years ago in 1984, Ronald Reagan came out with a series of advertisements which were called Morning in America. Reagan announced that America was back, America was exceptional, and America was very successful. We've had 40 years since then, in some people's mind at least, I think, of American decline and crisis. But maybe we need to rethink that. There's an interesting post by Rob Hodgkinson, who's the managing director of Signal Rank, a company that he co-founded with Keith Tier, who's my partner on the That Was the Week Tech Roundup podcast. And Rob had an interesting post this week, an ode to American exceptionalism. Rob is joining us from Menlo Park. Rob, is it morning in America again?
Hi, Andrew, and thanks for having me on the show. Look, I think the piece was really a reflection of some of the technological trends that we've seen in the last month or so, where you really had this iconic image of Elon Musk SpaceX collecting the Starship with his so-called chopsticks. And in my mind, someone who wasn't around during the moon landings, this is kind of, potentially the most exciting, most iconic moment that's happened in technology, certainly in my working lifetime.
Yeah, so, and you put it very nicely. That's why I actually dragged you onto the show. The beginning of the piece, Ode to American Exceptionalism. I'm going to read it out. What a time to be alive, you write. If watching SpaceX chopsticks collect a rocket going half the speed of sound doesn't stir you to the core, go touch some grass. The cheering and whooping of the mission-driven SpaceX team is hugely inspiring. Rob, you know that Elon Musk isn't everybody's favorite cup of tea. So not everyone is going to be cheering and whooping, but why should we be? What's the big deal about what happened at SpaceX in the last few weeks?
Well, yeah, I think, Elon Musk's politics aside, I mean, there's no doubt that he is one of the great technologists of our age, if not the great technologist of our age. And that has to be celebrated. I think there's, this idea of pushing consciousness across different planets should be celebrated, regardless of your politics. And my point was actually not necessarily about SpaceX. It was more that, as I said, this is kind of iconic and really kind of thinking about what are the technologies that have enabled this and what is America's role in, or what is America's position in actually enabling those kind of fundamental technologies.
Yeah, and coming back to Reagan's Morning in America, of course, Reagan came to power after the 70s, after the, I don't know if it's the catastrophe or disaster, certainly the rather gray America of Jimmy Carter. Is something building in America? I know you're not necessarily a political analyst. Maybe we'll talk about the election at some point. But has something happened on the tech front? Your piece about American exceptionalism is very much focused on AI. How central is these breakthroughs in AI in terms of revitalizing the American economy, Rob?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about the fact that you bring up Reagan is that if you look at some of the cultural zeitgeist that some of the leading VCs in the world are propagating, it is very much rooted in the 1980s, 1990s thinking within America. If you watch the Founders Fund videos, they are evoking this kind of 1980s kind of cultural moment. And to be honest, it's actually, really VCs are actually very good parrots or mirrors of what's happening in society more broadly. And actually, I would argue that we are seeing this kind of re-celebration of 1980s and 1990s kind of culture. If you look at, what have been the top movies in the US recently, they are out and out celebrations of Americana. I mean, the biggest movie in 2022 was Maverick. The biggest movie last year in America was Barbie, which, yes, had a kind of a feminist spin on Mattel's product, but it's really harking back to a different era, and that kind of cultural vibe is what the kind of
Although
VC.
it's worth noting, Robert, it's interesting that you bring up Barbie, because of course the other dominant film last year was Oppenheimer.
That's right.
Which looked back to a different period and had quite a different take on technology and the role of the state in technology. So America has a complicated history when it comes to technology and power and war.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, the iconography is of the 1980s, but actually, if you think about America's kind of prime time in technology, I think what people are really evoking is the 1960s, or the 1950s and 1960s, when you had this excitement around rocketry, around supersonic travel, arguably around nuclear power, and so I think those kind of trends you are seeing, even before the election. I think some of those kind of cultural trends you're seeing quite clearly.
Yeah, we are talking, of course, after the election. When I read your piece, I thought of the so-called Sputnik moment, which triggered the American explosion of innovation in the 60s. Do you think there was a Sputnik moment that has generated so much innovation of guys like Elon Musk?
I think, as you'll see in the piece, I mean, I basically make the point that America having a perceived or real threat is actually helpful for the kind of innovation ecosystem, and arguably for the country as a whole, because it forces the country to actually pull together in the same direction rather than being more kind of inward looking. And so I don't think you've had a similar Sputnik moment in the US at the moment, but you certainly have this bipartisan approach to China.
And I wonder whether, maybe it's not a concrete Sputnik moment in the way that Sputnik created the Sputnik moment, but maybe there were a series of TikTok moments where America began to wake up to the reality of China's new cultural and technological power.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And it is, one area where there is actually a kind of bipartisan agreement that, taking a serious look at kind of Chinese intentions is kind of a view taken across the aisle.
Yeah, and you mentioned in this piece, an excellent piece, Rob, Chip Wars by Miller, who's been on the show several times. That was a book that seemed to wake people up. You see this as an important book. What does it tell us about what we're going through?
I mean, I actually think I feel like I learn. I mean, I've been a student of Silicon Valley for a while. I've actually only been here physically for 4 years, but I feel like I learned more about Silicon Valley reading that book than any other book that I've read.
Funnily enough, he teaches at Tufts, so he's not actually based in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. No, but in terms of the history and the relationship between the kind of government and Silicon Valley, and the kind of trials and tribulations of that relationship, and I think what I argue in the piece is that actually there is this kind of rapprochement between government and Silicon Valley. Or if not a rapprochement, then certainly it's less antagonistic than it has been, in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and we did a show a few days ago with the co-authors of a new book called Unit X, which has actually been shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year award. about this new alliance, some people might consider it chilling, between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. What do you make of these new kinds of alliances? Of course, the internet itself came out of what some people consider the military-industrial complex in the United States. So this isn't a new thing, but there's certainly more and more intimate relations between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon and the American state in Washington, D.C. And now that that Musk, we have to assume is going to play an important role in the new administration, those relations are only going to get more intimate.
No, I think the pervasiveness of technology within society means that much of the low-hanging fruit in terms of technology's ability to operate in fairly regulatory-free or low regulatory environments has already been picked. So technology is now starting to encroach in much more highly regulated industries. And so that necessarily requires a better relationship between Silicon Valley and government. And that is not just in defense, but also in healthcare, education, manufacturing, etc.
And of course, infrastructure. The other story here, which you focus on in your piece, is this growing distance between the US and Europe and the UK. You're from the UK, as you said, you came over here 4 years ago. When I first came over to the US in the 80s, the GDP and the quality, the standard of living, average wage of Americans and Brits and Europeans was about the same. Now there's a dramatic difference. How important is this, Rob? Is this a cause or a consequence of American exceptionalism, or both?
You're talking about
the increasing wealth of the United States, certainly compared to Western Europe and the UK.
Yeah, look, I think the role of government today is pretty challenging in terms of the demographics that Western society see, in terms of kind of wage growth, and the challenge for government and for society is where does that growth come from? And I guess the argument of my piece is that actually potentially a core engine of that growth could be artificial intelligence and the productivity gains that enables, and this could be an underlying technology that drives some of that growth. So the United States clearly has a lead in this technology kind of downstream, and that should lead to faster growth from the US than in Europe.
There's a lot of fear, as you know, as well, of AI, fear of its impact on our productivity, even some people think our species. Are you at all concerned with the potential for AI to replace our jobs, to make us essentially redundant as a species? Or is that something that you think is exaggerated and misunderstood in this new AI revolution?
I think the risks are certainly elevated. Excuse me one second. My daughter's coming in. Hang on.
She probably has some strong views on AI.
No, darling. Well, there's very human intervention there.
Yeah, well, at least you were a real person, Rob, and not an AI controlling your child.
So your question was, what are the risks around AI?
Well, you talked about it increasing American wealth and productivity. For some people, does away with our jobs, makes us redundant. How do you respond to that critique?
I think it's a very real. There's a very real risk there, and I think given the election result that we've had, you would expect more kind of deregulation to come into not just AI, but across the economy, which you would have thought, yes, will unleash growth, but could also have material impact on on the well-being and incomes of pretty significant proportion of the workforce.
What do you make, Rob? I know you're not a political analyst, but what do you make of what seems to me to be a contradiction in the election? Whereas I think the majority still of the business community and certainly of innovators like Musk were supportive of Trump and will acquire more power in the new administration. But at the same time, Trump wasn't articulating Reagan's Morning in America message. He was suggesting quite the reverse, in fact, using sometimes some rather unpleasant language to describe what America has become. In this sense, is there a difference between the America of Donald Trump and the America of Ronald Reagan?
No, I think there's a difference between running a campaign and running an administration. And what we saw from the last Trump presidency was that the only thing you can predict is unpredictability. So I think we'll have to wait and see exactly what policies and which personnel are actually promoted, because as you know, I think policy is really people, and so the people who are in the administration pushing that agenda will have different flavors of the agenda they want to push. So, Trump is more concerned at its core with kind of traditional industries. But having said that, he's obviously picked JD Vance, who's a former VC. He's advised by Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and others. So the extent to which the administration focuses on traditional industries rather than semiconductors and AI is certainly going to be something to watch.
And he's also, of course, he seems to be a big fan of crypto, although he's often a fan of something until he's not. Is this something that you think is important in terms of American exceptionalism? Is it conceivable that in this new administration, if we're talking about structural changes, that we will see the emergence of a real crypto economy where the economic authority of the American central bank is somehow replaced by a distributed financial network?
No, I don't think. I mean, as I said, I think the unpredictability is really the kind of core tenet of of his style, and so it really depends on the personnel who maintain kind of his ear throughout the administration. Just going back to my piece, I mean, it wasn't really about American exceptionalism per se. It was really about how specifically in relation to AI, that is where there is an American exceptionalism today. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be American exceptionalism, for a sustained period of time. I think.
Morning in America, of course, never lasts forever. There's always an afternoon and an evening. Your piece does compare in an interesting way Europe and America. You describe Europe as Y Combinator without the equity. You talk about I think what you interpret at least as the overregulation of the European economy when it comes to AI. Is that the real problem? Because there's a lot of smart Europeans, a lot of innovative Europeans, but they all seem to end up here. Many of the fathers of AI are, in fact, from Europe. Even the so-called godfather of AI just won the Nobel Prize, Geoffrey Hinton, is British, and the founder of DeepMind, who also won a Nobel Prize this year, is British. So what's going on here when it comes to comparing the innovation in Europe around AI and in the United States?
Yeah, I think I made the point that actually Europe has been a fantastic factory of AI talent. There are actually more AI professionals in Europe than there are in the US. the problem is, as you mentioned, is that people don't tend to stay around. So Europe has generated 22% of AI experts or professionals, but actually only 14% of them are still working in the continent. So, and that is true both for academics, but equally kind of practitioners, and that flows through into companies too. So, as you mentioned, I mean, Geoffrey Hinton famously, moved from the UK and ultimately found himself in Toronto, in part because he couldn't get the funding in the UK for his focus on kind of neural networks. So, and again, he, if you look at some of the students under his tutelage, it was, Ilya from OpenAI, Jan LeCun, Meta. So, some of these great kind of European AI thinkers have, as you said, ended up in the US. And unfortunately, from the European perspective, that's turned from kind of a trickle into a flood. And the question is, how do you? And I don't have any answers, but how do you actually stop that from a European's perspective?
Well, you're another European entrepreneur who came over to the US. Your partner Keith Teare came here in 25 years ago. Are people coming because of the opportunity, because of the lower taxes, because of the climate? I mean, you're in Menlo Park, Northern California is very nice. Why did you come here, and what again does this tell us about perhaps the crisis of innovation in Europe at the moment?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is a unique ecosystem, and the inputs in Silicon Valley, many have tried to replicate, and no one has succeeded yet. In terms of that combination of talent, capital, and the kind of regulatory regime, and there's a book that I referenced at the end of the article by Harvard
Josh
professor.
Lerner, yeah, but Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Why public efforts to boost entrepreneurship and venture capital have failed, and what to do about it. What does this tell us? That you can't replicate? Everyone wants their own Silicon Valley, but you're suggesting it's impossible to replicate?
I don't think I'm suggesting that. I'm saying that, I mean, this book was written, I remember reading this book about 15 years ago.
It came out in 2012 originally.
Yeah. So this book has been around for a while, and the lessons from it are, make for depressing reading if you are a kind of public policy official in somewhere other than the US, because it's just very challenging to kind of replicate the magic that has evolved within Silicon Valley, and despite kind of best efforts from people to try and do that. That also sounds maybe potentially overly negative, and that if you look at what's happened in Europe, the Middle East, and China in the last 10 or 20 years, those ecosystems are flourishing, and the number of unicorns created outside of the US has grown dramatically. But when it comes to trillion-dollar companies, I think there are 6 in the world today, and 5 of them are probably an hour's drive from where I'm sitting.
It is an astonishing story. What about the role of regulation? You touch on it in the piece. Is this, particularly in the EU, is this the problem? Over-regulation? The Europeans have been very, quote unquote, innovative when it comes to dealing with big tech, but it doesn't seem to have benefited them. They don't have their own search engine or powerful e-commerce platform, or hardware company like Apple. So is regulation a failure in your view in Europe, in the EU?
Well, no, I think that regulation is downstream from the actual problem, which, as you outlined, particularly in relation to AI, whether it is the chips from NVIDIA or the hyperscalers or ultimately the foundational models, the leaders in those fields are currently in the US. Now, in Europe, you do have Mistral is obviously building its in France is building its kind of foundational models. I think the challenge they will have is remaining independent. So because building these foundational models is so capital intensive, and unless you have either a sovereign wealth fund behind you or a Magnificent Seven kind of balance sheet, it's just very challenging to kind of keep up.
Yeah, I mean it's like with OpenAI. I mean I don't know how many billions of dollars now have been invested in the company, but certainly several. And it's a startup. It's not public, but it's worth over $150 billion. So it's not like the 1990s. We're not in the startup world of the first internet revolution, are we?
Not yet. I think I actually wrote another piece recently about why the opportunity for venture capital in AI is not yet. I mean, with these technology cycles, you tend to need to build the infrastructure layer first and actually have some level of stability there before the kind of venture capital opportunity emerges. So if you look back at, even go back to kind of the internet itself, obviously funded by the government and DARPA with the kind of ARPANET. And then more recently, the mobile and cloud revolutions were the infrastructure was in place from the kind of large incumbents before you could build the kind of Ubers and Facebooks of the world on top of that infrastructure. And the same is true in AI. So it's not really a venture capital game yet. And Sequoia wrote this piece a couple of weeks ago about how there is actually a white space for the application layer of AI, whether that is agents or something that we haven't even thought about yet, where with a much smaller check, you can actually build a kind of power law scale business, without needing $100 billion.
Yeah, although what you're saying is very interesting, Rob, but it kind of contradicts what you're doing at SignalRank, a platform for investing in Series B startups, because if we're not at the point yet where AI is an opportunity for venture, where are the places to invest at SignalRank? What's SignalRank doing if there aren't any AI startups yet?
Yeah,
or if the AI startups are so well capitalized that they're impossible to actually invest in?
So SignalRank is a index of what we believe to be the highest potential Series Bs globally. And the nice thing about investing in an index is that in kind of Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard's famous words, an index fund which is one that removes sector risk, geography risk, manager risk, and vintage risk. And that is true for our strategy here too. So we are basically surfing on companies backed by the best investors in the world across any one vintage. So our expectation, what that means is that in any year, we'll be investing in what we believe to be the top 5% of Series Bs.
My advice to your marketing department then is you need some images of surfers. Maybe go to Santa Cruz or down to LA, get some nice surfing images, because that's
but to your question, I mean, we're not exclusively investing in AI. It is true that
isn't that where all the money is, though? Really, ultimately, that's where all the money will be.
Look, I think there are, from our vantage point, and we see Series B from over 200 seed managers. So we're saying about 50 or 60 Series Bs a month, which is about half of all Series Bs globally. From our vantage point, there are basically three sectors that are attracting Series B capital at the moment. The first is AI, which is not surprising. And then the other two are really this combination of kind of software and hardware, where yes, they're underlying these businesses is kind of AI technology, but they don't really present themselves as that. So climate tech and defense tech are really the other kind of two sectors where we are seeing high quality companies attract capital from the best investors in the world.
Well, let's go finally back to Morning in America, Ronald Reagan's promise that America was exceptional and about to take off once again. Back then, everyone was fearful of Japan. Now it's China. You cover China in your piece. A lot of fears of Chinese innovation. It gets manifested in the political sphere by people's concern on TikTok. Some people want to shut TikTok down. How much innovation, in your view, is there in AI in China? And what does the China story tell us about American AI exceptionalism?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I don't speak Mandarin, and so I'm only my perspective here is really based on kind of Western media, Western readings of the kind of what's happening in China. But my perspective is, actually much influenced by a kind of FT article recently about how innovation in China is currently going through a challenging time, in part because of the kind of broader macro slowdown that's happened in China since the pandemic, and in part because of kind of regulatory crackdown that the large companies like Tencent and Alibaba have kind of endured recently, and that's had kind of second and third order effects in the related to the kind of strategic competition of the US is the fact that international investors have now kind of shied away from investing in Chinese startups, and US capital markets are largely no longer a kind of exit avenue for kind of Chinese startups. Again, if you're a Chinese student in the US or the West, if there are fewer kind of startup opportunities back in China, you're more likely to stick around in the US and West and look for kind of opportunities here.
So, Rob, your message really for any innovator, entrepreneur, technologist, if they're watching in China or Western Europe, Middle East, Africa, they should all come and live in the US because it's morning once again in America. Is that fair?
I don't think it's that optimistic. I think there are massive risks on the horizon for technology and innovation in the US.
What are, I mean, finally, Rob, you bring up the risks. What are they in the US?
Look, I think we have a new president-elect. The risks of tariffs are significant. The risks to immigration are significant. I think people are expecting a kind of wave of deregulation, but there has to be a question about by whom. So, to what extent will some of the actors involved in that deregulation actually achieve regulatory capture themselves? Is a question that we should be asking ourselves. But as I said at the top, I think the overarching theme should be one of unpredictability, because we don't know what the kind of personnel will be in the Trump administration in the next 4 years. So yes, I'm optimistic in terms of the direction of technology and the direction of the kind of AI developments, but that's not, it's not to overlook, some of the risks that are very real and are kind of short-term risks that we have to manage.
Now, they're the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. Rob Hodgkinson, author of An Ode to American Exceptionalism. Finally, some optimism on the American front. Maybe it is indeed morning in America. Rob, thank you so much. Very interesting insights into what's going on in the US, SpaceX, AI. Keep in touch, Rob. We need your expertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.